Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to my video on post-flop play according to opponents. I'm really excited about this one. I think it's going to make a lot of players post-flop play much stronger and introduce you to the really important concepts as to how you should be playing post-flop. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to look at the 4 different player types: tight passive, loose passive, tight aggressive and loose aggressive, and I'm going to go through a little bit of theory on each, probably about 10 minutes, and then I'll spend 20 minutes going through different hands. I'll play, in fact when I say different hands, the same 4 hands, and show you how you would play those post-flop against the different opponents and why. So starting off with the theory for tight passive players, the first thing that's important is that their calling range is generally filtered towards the upper end of the deck. So what that means is that if you raise and they call, they're not going to be turning up the low cards very often. Generally it's going to be Broadway cards and decent aces and higher pocket pairs. So what this means for us is that the high flops are generally bad flops for us to c-bet as far as getting folds, and you'd probably only be c-betting them if you hit them. Also be aware that these guys can be trapping on a strong holding, so they won't always re-raise their 10s, jacks, queens, kings and aces. Keep that in mind post-flop. The tight passive players will give up dry boards very easily. They're good boards to c-bet. They'll also give up low wet boards easily, so you can c-bet those with confidence. It's just the high boards that we worry about. Their post-flop calling range, I'd put them on any pair or any draw, which makes them pretty much hit or miss players. And I would say that their raising range is going to be 2 pair or better early on, and later on, of course, once the stack sizes change, then you expect that to loosen up. Finally, this is a fairly important point, and that is that bet size doesn't really affect their post-flop fold percentage very much. If there's 120 chips in the pot and you're betting 60, 80, 100, 120, it doesn't matter. They're folding if they've missed, which means that you're better off trying the lower bet sizes when in fact you're trying to steal. So that's a little bit of theory on the tight passive guys, and now we'll move on and have a look at the loose passive guys. So loose passive players, their calling range is quite different to the tight passive players. A lot of these guys will be calling any 2 cards pre-flop. Even for huge raises, I've seen some guys literally call their whole stack on 9-3 offsuit. But of course, a lot of the loose passive guys won't be that loose. They can also trap you on a strong holding. These passive players will not necessarily re-raise you, just like the tight passive players. These guys are not folding easily on any board, dry or wet, but especially wet boards. So if the board's wet and you've missed it, it's probably not a good spot to be c-betting, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Their post-flop calling range is super wide, including gut shots, an overcard or overcards to the board, straight draws, flush draws, ace or king high, maybe even queen high, or just what appears to be random cards. Their post-flop raising range is once again 2 pair plus early on in the match. These guys are passive. What you often get is they flat call, raise you on the river. That is always going to be more than 1 pair early on. Later on, of course, they might loosen up according to the stack sizes. And once again, the bet size doesn't affect the post-flop fold percentage much. What this means in this case is that because they're generally calling regardless of how much of the pot you're betting, that you can bet according to the strength of your hand, meaning betting very strongly when you've hit a good flop, assuming that you think there's something in the flop for them to give them some excuse to call. So that's the theory for the loose passive guys. Now we'll look at the tight aggressive guys. So the tight aggressive guys, once again you'd expect their calling range to be filtered towards the upper end of the deck, meaning that high flops would worry us a lot more than low flops. However, the difference between tight aggressive and tight passive, you'd expect these guys to be 3-betting. They're strong and medium strength holdings, so you're not going to be too worried about them trapping with aces, kings, queens, that sort of thing. These guys will sometimes float you on low dry boards, which means that these are good targets for firing a second barrel, and we'll take a look at that later on when we look at the hands. their post-flop calling range would be any pair or any draw, plus overcards on dry boards, as I mentioned before. Their post-flop raising range is looser than the passive players, top pair or better early on in the match, later on loosening up depending on stacks, and then finally the bet size doesn't affect the post-flop fold percentage much, meaning that in this case a standard sort of 60% when the blinds are low, or 50% C bet size is probably best. You wouldn't be altering your bet sizing according to the strength of your hand as you might do against a loose passive player. So that's a quick look at the tight aggressive guys, and we'll move on to the loose aggressive guys. The loose aggressive guys, their calling range pre-flop can be super wide, just like the loose passive guys, but you would expect them to re-raise you on strong holdings or even medium strength holdings. They're not folding post-flop easily on any boards, but especially wet boards, just like the loose passive players. And in fact, on wet boards, they're likely to get very aggressive with any draw or pair. And we're a little bit careful when a board comes down, especially low and wet, not to get ourselves in a huge pot unless we have a pretty strong holding. So probably pot controlling those wet boards. Their post-flop calling range is super wide, just like the loose passive guys, including gut shots, overcards, or an overcard, straight and flush draws, although they may well raise a draw, ace or king high, random cards. Their post-flop raising range, as I mentioned before, draws, they'll raise on air on dry boards, they'll raise because your bet size looks small and they think that you're weak. And here, the bet sizing does affect their post-flop aggression level. The larger the bet size from you, the more likely they'll just flat call it instead of attacking it. So you need to keep that in mind when you're looking at your bet sizing. So that's a quick look at the 4 different player types, a little bit of theory, and now I'm going to go through some hands and look at them from the point of view of each different player and how would you play those hands optimally against those different player types. Alright, so let's have a look at some hands, and as you can see in this first one we've got Queen 9, and for whatever reason we've decided to raise our hand. So we go ahead and raise it up to 100 and the tight passive player calls us. So immediately going back to that first point, you're thinking, well, he's going to have most likely high cards. Suited connectors with these blinds, not so likely. Low pocket pairs would also be possible, but most of the time he's going to have high cards like broadways or higher pocket pairs. Alright, flop comes down, King Jack 9, he checks. Is this a good flop for us to bet? Against a tight passive player, I do not think it's a particularly good flop. I think it's going to hit his calling range. He's going to have, you know, a king or a jack, or maybe a queen 10 or ace 10 or something like that. I think it's going to get our C bet will get called a lot, and I would probably in this spot simply check behind. However, if you do decide to bet, how much would I bet? I think 110 should do the job here. You don't need to be betting 160, 170, that sort of really large raise size. It's pretty ugly against this guy. Very close to half pot's enough to get the fold if he is going to fold. So that's his first hand looking at the sort of fairly high flop. Let's look at another one here. As you can see, the same starting hand, and we make the same raise size, get called, and this time it's quite a dry flop. This is a very good flop for us to see bet, despite the fact that we haven't hit it, because it will not hit his calling range very often, and he will not call us very often. So he checks there, we fire out a bet, 100 or 110 doesn't matter, and we get called, which is a little surprising on this sort of flop. So I'd probably be thinking hands like Jack 10, Queen Jack, King Jack, Ace Jack, possibly also something like A7 or pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket 3s. That would be the sort of range that I'd put him on. Turn comes giving us an open-ender. He checks behind, and I would not be firing a second barrel here. I don't think that we're getting many folds. The 10 is not a card that I can represent. It's not like it's an ace or a king or a queen where I can sort of say, hey, I just hit that for my pre-flop raise. You know, the 10 doesn't really look like it's the sort of hand that I'm going to hit. If he had floated this, which is unlikely on something like king, queen, or ace, king, he's certainly not folding now that he's got sort of 2 overs and some sort of draw. So I would not fire a second barrel in that spot for those reasons. Alright, let's look at another hand here. Once again, starting with the same starting hand, same raise pre-flop and get called, and the flop comes down 3, 4, 5 against a tight passive player. This is a very good flop, and I would bet it 100 or 110 around there is enough, expecting to get a fold probably 70-80% of the time. And if he does call me, then I'd be putting him on stuff like Ace6, Ace5 or Ace4, Ace3 possible, pocket 3s, 4s, 5s, or over pairs, sort of 6s, 7s, 8s and so on. That would be pretty much the range that I'd put him on, and certainly not firing a second barrel in this spot. I think that he's not going to be floating us enough that we'll be getting folds when the turn comes. And the turn, he's a 10. Anything that he was calling us on the flop, he's now calling us on the turn with, and therefore it's not a good spot to fire a second barrel. Alright, let's have a look at the last example here for the tight passive player, and this time I've got Queen 5 and decide to raise for whatever reason, maybe because we feel we're due to raise, and we've hit sort of top pair on this low wet flop. As I said, wouldn't hit his calling range very often. Betting here 80, 100, 110, doesn't matter about the bet size so much. And if he calls us, once again, the same sort of range, Ace3, Ace4, Ace5, Ace6, pocket 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, etc. Should we fire a second barrel? Well, we're ahead of some of his range, Ace3 and Ace4, and Ace6, and possibly Ace7. That's probably enough that I would fire a second barrel here, and I think I would probably bet maybe 200 chips. If he raised me at this stage, I would insta-fold. So that's a quick look at a little bit of hand texture considering the nature of tight passive players. Let's move on to another player type. Okay, let's take a look at loose passive villains or calling stations, and same series of hands. First one, same raise size here with Queen 9, and flop comes down King Jack 7, 2 clubs. He checks, and I'm probably going to bet this. I've raised pre-flop. His calling range is so wide that even though the board's fairly wet, I still think there's some value betting here. First of all, we could be ahead. You know, he could be sitting there with 6-4 for all we know. And second of all, we can sort of be building the pot with very little risk that he's going to raise us unless he's sitting there with a monster. So probably just betting a traditional 120 into the 200 pot. He calls us, and we bink this magic 10 on the river, and now I'll be making quite a large second barrel. You'd never check here and trap him once he checks. Now you're trying to get value out of a flush draw. You're trying to get value out of a random queen or ace where he'll call on the gut shot. Getting value on the king or the jack or the 7. Getting value on even random 8s or 9s that he might have called on. He might have called on, you know, and picked a sort of gut shut up on the turn here. So I'd probably be betting a board like this, maybe about 320, and expecting to get called. So quite a large second barrel here, and that's pretty much the idea behind that hand. Let's move on to the next one. Alright, raise once again, get called, and this is a dry flop, which we've missed quite obviously. I would normally fire one barrel here. We might be getting a fold, we might be ahead of his calling range, and 120, the same size as before. Once he calls it, I'm going to give up. I can hit, well, when I say give up, I'm not going to fire a second barrel. If he's calling the flop, there's nothing that's going to stop him from calling the turn here. All I have is a draw. I don't want to be getting my chips in on the draw. I want to be getting my chips in when the draw hits. So I would just check behind here on the turn, and obviously if I hit up with an 8, if I hit an 8 or a king on the river, or even a queen, I can bet for value, and the rest of the time I'll just check it down and give it up. You don't fire a second barrel here and commit him and miss the river, and then be in a situation where you have to make a large, horrible bluff, which is likely to get called by a station. Just give up and see if you can bink or not. So that's that hand. Let's look at this next one. Once again, you've raised, and the flop comes down 3, 4, 5, so quite a wet flop and a low flop. This is not a flop that you are getting many folds on. He's going to call you on a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, the gut shot, and he'll be calling you on over cards and obviously over pairs. I mean, that's just nearly all of his range you're getting a call on. You have nothing but queen high. It's a very wet board, so even if you're ahead at the moment, you very often won't be ahead by the river. I would just give up in this spot. Check it down. If I hit something on the turn, fantastic, I can bet then. If not, be prepared to give up the board. Firing a barrel in this spot against a loose passive player is just giving money away and putting yourself in an unnecessarily difficult position, building a pot in a spot where he was never going to fold, and you have a very, very marginal holding. Alright, and the last hand here against the loose passive guys. You raise on your queen 5 for whatever reason. I personally wouldn't raise on queen 5, but just for this example we say we do. And you've hit top pair on this low wet board. Here, after he checks, I think you need to be betting quite aggressively. The reason being that I expect you're ahead at this stage, and you want him to pay for his draws. If he's got a 2 or a 6 or a 7, then you want him to pay for the privilege of sucking out. If he's got a 3 or a 4 or a worse 5, you want to get good value off him. So I'd probably be betting maybe about 160, even 170 or 180 into this pot. So there's a few tips on loose passive players depending on the flop texture. Let's go have a look now at tight aggressive players. Alright, looking at the tight aggressive guys, and I've put one extra hand in here because there's a point I want to make. First one, of course, we raise up to queen 9, and on this flop I think this really hits his calling range. Higher cards, I don't think you're getting a fold very often on the flop. I don't think you're ahead very often on the flop, and I would just check behind. The problem about betting also is that if you do bet, you give him a chance to raise you, and it is likely if he's tight aggressive you're getting raised on this flop, and that then will sort of not give you a free chance to hit your gut shot. So I would just check behind. When we do hit the magic 10 on the turn, I'd be betting about 140 chips, much more than that, and it's going to look like you've just hit a monster. So he checks about 140, looks right to me. If you're betting sort of 200, 190, yes, you may get called because this will hit his range a lot, but you're not going to get much river action, whereas this smaller bet size could set up a raise on the turn or river action. So I think this is about the right size here. Okay, next one, and a dry flop. I would expect this to miss his calling range a lot. I'd be firing here. When he does call, I'd be putting him on hands like Queen Jack, Jack 10, Jack 9, possibly King Jack. I wouldn't expect him to have ace-jack in this spot very often, because I think he would have 3-bet me pre-flop. Other possible hands might be ace-7, something like that. Or maybe he might have called you with king-queen if he didn't 3-bet that. Alright, when the turn comes, I think any of the hands that were calling you on the flop are now going to call you on the turn, so you should definitely check behind here and try and get a free shot at your draw. Alright, this next one you raise, and this time it's a low wet flop. Because it's low, it shouldn't hit his calling range. I expect that we could be getting enough folds on this to make betting EV+. So when he checks, I'd fire out 120. I expect his calling range to be stuff like ace 3, ace 4, ace 5, ace 6, ace 7, and overcards. But I think he'll fold enough of the overcards that it can be a profitable spot for us to bet. When he calls and the 10 comes on the turn, I just give up the hand. I wouldn't bother firing a second barrel. Then, as I say, it's just a little bit too wet to fire a second barrel, because the hands like ace 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 won't be folding. You could also have, king 3, 4, 5 suited as well. I mean, that's also possible. Alright, raising here, and slightly different flop, 3, 4, 8. So it's low and dry. I would fire a barrel here, and his calling range, ace 3, ace 4, ace 5, ace 2. Obviously, I think he'd probably raise on ace 8 if he didn't raise pre-flop, as well as overcards. When the 10 comes on the turn, this looks like a good spot to fire a second barrel, because now he's going to fold a lot of those overcards that he originally called your first barrel with, and a good decent sized second barrel, like maybe 290 here. This is a very profitable spot, sort of firing a second barrel on dry boards against tight aggressive players who have probably called with overcards. Alright, and this last hand here, you've raised on queen 5, hit top pair, wet board, same raising range as I talked, calling range as I talked about before. So definitely a slightly bigger barrel here to make him pay in case he's got ace 3, ace 4, king 3, king 4, or he calls on overcards. So that's looking at the tight aggressive guys. Let's now have a look at the loose aggressive guys. Let's look at the same series of flops with the final player type, which is the loose aggressive player. And here in the first hand we catch this king jack 7 flop, and he checks. This is a good flop for us to bet. What's more important against the loose aggressive guys is, can we represent anything post flop? We know his calling range is any 2 cards, and what we're looking for in the flop is a flop where we can sort of say that this has hit our pre-flop raising range. So I go ahead and fire here. If he calls, and obviously we bink the 10, he's quite loose. He's going to call our bet here on a sort of ace, queen, jack, king, 10, 9 or 8. So we'd fire a big second barrel here, just like against a loose passive player. So the logic here is a little bit different. Against the tight players, we're thinking, does it hit their calling range? Against the loose passive players, that's not really the case. We're sort of just more betting for value, but firing one barrel now and again to try and get a fold if we think we could be ahead. Against the loose aggressive guys, we're thinking, does this hit our raising range, which is a slightly different concept. Alright, next hand, once again we raise. In this spot, I think you can represent the jack, but not much else. Pretty dry board. I think checking here is fine, and I also think betting is not too bad either. So checking or betting is okay. He's probably likely to raise you on this sort of flop because he knows it's dry, but this is kind of down to the individual guy. Is he aggressive in these spots, or will he just flat call or fold a bit, in which case you can make up your own mind. Against an unknown loose aggressive guy, I'm probably betting here. Alright, the next one, raise, and we hit our low wet flop. I am not going to bet this. The reason being I don't expect him to fold much. He's obviously calling me on 3s and 4s and 5s and 2s and 6s and 7s and overcards. And even worse, he'll get very aggressive if he has any sort of draw or pair. He could well be shoving or raising me, meaning I don't get a chance to hit my overcard. So the best way for me to play this is just check behind and then try and bink an overcard on the turn and control pot size then by betting, but not too much. Not betting and letting him get aggressive on his draw or pair. Alright, and the final hand here, we raise on our Queen 5 hit top pair. I would make a decent sized bet. Now here, he could shove us on a draw or something, in which case we're going to have to give it up, and obviously that would suck. However, I think this slightly larger raise size is going to control him so that he'll just flat call the draws. If I bet something like 120, we're looking a little weaker and he's more tempted to get aggressive and raise on his draws and stuff. But I think the higher bet size here might control him a little bit better, given the message that we have something here and not trying to push us, don't try and push us around. So that's looking at a few different flops against the different player types. I hope this video makes sense to you, and I really hope that it gives you an idea. What are you looking for post-flop, and when should you be firing one barrel? When should you be firing two barrels? I think even though it's a fairly short video, there's a lot of information in here, and I suggest you watch it 2 or 3 times to really make sense of it. And then of course you can always leave me some questions which I'll be happy to answer. So that's this video on different opponents and post-flop play, when to fire one barrel, when to check behind, when to fire a second barrel. I hope you've enjoyed it, and until the next one, run good.